You'll notice it's only Tennant that runs with the blanket.
Yeah, I am going to wonder how much that's going to distract me during this recording, seeing the man. It's like, I wonder what that marshmallow thinks of energy policy.
You'd be surprised how normal it starts to seem after just a short time.
You've got no idea, Craig, how much more articulate I would have been for the last 50-odd episodes had I not been distracted by Tennant's blanket. This is a Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts and one special guest. We have, of course, Global Vice President for promoting the Patreon, the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, folks. It's lovely to be with you on Gadigal country. Happy to report the Patreon is being patronised, and actually we should do a after-the-fact promo for our recent BOCO. We went all things nuclear following the coalition's opening salvo on the sort of makings of an energy policy. So if you want to hear more about that, you can head over to the Patreon.
We may have gone nuclear, Frankie, but we didn't strike first.
We did not. But it was too hard to resist, wasn't it?
It was a bit of fun. We're also joined by a man who has lit the candles and scattered the rose petals as he awaits, with bated breath, the release of the Australian Government's carbon leakage review. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
And who knows, thanks to the magical timey-wimey nature of podcast recording, by the time you, gentle listener, hear this, it could already be out. What a glorious future you exist in. But I have to struggle through this veil of tears until the blessed day when the second paper of the carbon leakage review comes out. But I believe that day cometh, and that right soon.
It was the night before CBAM myths.
Yeah, that's right. And all was quiet.
Indeed. And finally, we are joined by a writer, a broadcaster, and an actual comedian who is perhaps best known for his wars on amorphous nouns, Craig Rucastle. G'day, Craig.
Good to be here. Very good. Thanks for having me. I am slightly concerned that you said that this podcast goes too long when you don't have a timer and you've not started the timer.
This is actually one of the issues that we regularly have.
I was also really sad because had the timer been started, I would have been able to work out how long it took before CBAM was mentioned. But unfortunately, there was no official timer, so I will just have to say it was probably within the first 2 minutes.
According to my calculations, the intervals between CBAM mentions have been reducing according to a formula that implies 2 CBAM mentions before the podcast even begins next episode.
God. Is now the point at which, just in order to shut up the chat about CBAM, that we concede that we're going to cover this paper when it's released?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Tennant would resign from the podcast if we didn't do that, Frankie. So I think we're kind of committed at this point.
That's true.
Just large eyes and gentle sobs. That's all.
As a listener, I'm excited, so there you go.
Oh, that's what I like to hear.
He doesn't need more encouragement, Craig.
He really, really doesn't. On this week's show, we consider a paper on the perils of Earth system tipping points and the potential of so-called positive tipping points to bring us back from the brink. But first, the Australian Energy Market Operator has released its 2024 Integrated System Plan, which it bills as a roadmap through the energy transition. Much of this document is broadly consistent with the last ISP released in 2022, with the optimum development pathway for the electricity system featuring big investments in rooftop solar, large-scale renewables, batteries and transmission infrastructure. What is very 2024 about this year's ISP is the focus on the risks that beset the optimum pathway and on galvanising action to address them. These risks are many and varied, ranging from coal exiting the system before we have built enough replacement capacity to consumer energy resources remaining stubbornly uncoordinated, which would require us to spend even more billions on supply-side infrastructure. Tennant, as always, there is a lot in this document. What did you make of it?
So the ISP is an evolutionary process, and like biological evolutionary processes, you can look inside it and see all kinds of remnants of what went before.
All kinds of crap in the chromosome, Tennant.
Yeah. Because this thing started out in the dim and distant days before the Finkel Review of the National Electricity Market as the National Transmission Planning Report. And it still is a quite transmission-oriented document. It models all kinds of things. It informs all of us in all kinds of ways. But the thing that it most directly plugs into is decisions about the planning of and the approvals for great big transmission lines, which are a thing that we have only recently started building again after a bit of a gap.
And in terms of that evolution, Tennant, I think it's worth noting that while AEMO writes the ISP and prepares the ISP, its scope is formally defined in the National Electricity Rules. And so if you want to sort of significantly change the ISP, you need to put in a rule change request, right?
You do.
So it's not as simple as Daniel Westerman sort of waking up one morning and deciding he wants to co-optimize across supply and demand. There are some sort of formal processes one needs to work through, right?
Yeah, there are. And I even got engaged in a not a Twitter spat, but a LinkedIn imbroglio recently over me and somebody else doing our best impressions of Bush National Electricity Rules lawyers debating what exactly the freedom of action permitted to AEMO under those rules was, with regard specifically to could they just do some scenarios where government energy policies were not achieved? Or could they do some scenarios where certain laws were just ignored? And
Are we talking about the ban on nuclear there, Tennant?
You must be psychic, Frankie, because that was the very focus of my counterpart's interest.
I'm shocked.
Yes. But before nuclear derails us yet again.
No, I think Craig's been hanging out for this.
No, we'll get to nuclear, I'm sure.
Yeah.
When after we get to gas. But I do want to point out. I want to ask you guys why this change has been made. I was a big fan in the 2022 ISP of the coordinated DER storage, distributed energy resources, which have been renamed consumer energy resources. Then DER has become CER. What's happened?
Well, DER's that's just so 5 minutes ago.
So 2022, Craig.
Yeah, so 2022.
CER is the new hotness. If anybody knew what it was, at least it would be hot.
I also noticed they've gotten rid of, there was no mention of vehicle to grid, which they were quite excited by in 2022.
Yeah, I think they're a bit more cautious in some ways and concrete. So the coordination of the charging times of electric vehicles is like an absolutely essential thing, like just a minimal level of coordination that they don't all show up at 5 p.m. on a weekday. And that's a much easier thing to achieve than vehicle-to-home services, where more homes are running themselves off their car batteries at times when it's suitable for them. And that, in turn, is easier by a country mile than vehicle-to-grid, which is like a super juicy prospect, all that underutilised battery capacity available to the grid for free, effectively. But it takes a lot of doing, and they're not yet assuming that a vast amount of that potential is unlocked. They're being a little more cautious.
They still do, yeah. They still mention that some EVs may be able to discharge electricity for direct use to household batteries or back into the grid. But, it seems like they've taken a step back from the enthusiasm in 2022.
Well, there's also been this fight about just how ambitious or unambitious are they being on the whole of the demand side. And we've talked before about the scenarios for gas demand that were borrowed from the same process that produced the ISP. Those demand scenarios were borrowed for the future gas strategy that we spoke about in a recent episode. And the AEMO people will say, and I think like reasonably fairly, that if people don't like how modest the change in gas demand is in their forecasts, it's still well beyond what any policies at any level of government in Australia are yet capable of delivering. So governments would have to lift their game on gas transition significantly before it is directly and literally AEMO scenarios that are dragging the chain. That's what they would say.
Yeah. And most often the argument is made in the other direction, right? From advocates, I don't know, like me, who look at what's baked into this document. And again, like we said this in 2022, and, you know, not a huge amount has changed since then, but the assumptions around the electrification of households go well beyond what's in place from various levels of government to achieve it. The risk is that we're assuming all of this is going to happen. There would be dividends in lots of ways for that, but there's not the supporting policy. So like a lot of advocates are using that as a kick in the pants to government to be getting on with it and doing more.
It is a lot. The other thing I thought was interesting in it, just when we were talking on the consumer side, I thought it was fascinating. They said if consumer batteries are well coordinated, it would avoid up to $4.1 billion being spent on additional utility scale storage in the NEM. And it just feels like at the moment, very few policies, you know, there's a new one's just come in New South Wales, but very few policies seem to be really pushing, you know, batteries to households.
Yeah.
I was actually really encouraged by that figure, which I think was AEMO dipping its toe into the water, is sort of explaining like the interaction between activities behind the meter and in front of the meter and the implications for, you know, investment in supply side infrastructure. In my perfect world, that kind of analysis would go well beyond batteries and start talking about coordination of electric loads, about thermal performance of households on the grid that are suddenly heating with electricity rather than gas. I think there's a bigger story to tell around that, but it's a step forward from 2022 that figure is being called out and a specific number is being put on the implication for supply side investment if some of that coordination doesn't happen.
Yeah.
There's so much more potential, particularly when we talk about action at the household level, of avoiding unnecessary infrastructure augmentation, not just from batteries, but deep energy efficiency to upgrade our crappy old housing stock, insulating them, putting demand response enabled reverse cycle air conditioners and heat pump hot water systems. This is a nice start, but also to your point, Craig, on what is consumer energy resources. It's sort of the effective management of all of those things together. It'd be nice to see a more fulsome view of the potential in all of that, but I suspect we're waiting until ISP 2026.
Yeah.
Make a date.
Well, so just to connect the dots there, the benefits in the modelling come from not just the presence of batteries in the grid, but incentives for those, or one way or another, whether it's incentives or regulation or voluntary action, that those batteries are used along with household solar and EVs in ways that assist the whole grid. And so the incentives that governments are almost certainly going to come out with more of in the battery space, they produce those benefits if they're paired with something like the controversial change in tariffs for the use of the electricity network to export as well as to import energy. Now, there's different ways of going at that. The approach in New South Wales and elsewhere is a bit more hard-edged. The electricity distributors in Victoria proposed an approach that there was a version that had export tariffs, but there was also a default tariff they proposed that just had a time differentiation between a solar soak period in the middle of the day when it'd be incredibly cheap to use the network, and a quite expensive time from like 4 to 7 p.m. and then off-peak after that, or maybe 4 to 9 p.m. Now, the Victorian government is cautious enough about all this that they said, no, all that stuff, it's just opt-in. If people want to stay on the kind of undifferentiated tariffs they're on now, tariffs with an off-peak that's built around the cycle of coal and trying to bring energy use up a bit in the middle of the night so the coal doesn't need to ramp off. Well, if people want to stay on that, then they can, because we're worried about immediate losers from a messy transition. And I don't know, we've got to find a way around that, or we're not going to realise all these benefits.
Hey, Craig, it sounded like you wanted to get into the gas peaking generation that is forecast.
Second most controversial part of this.
We almost skipped over gas.
Did you have a hot take you wanted to share with us?
I don't think I have a hot take. I mean, it's gone up, 15 gigawatt of flexible gas. It was seen to be 10 gigawatt in 2022.
Yeah.
So it's increased. It's interesting because I was thinking about this in the context of the nuclear debate. And I think my initial perspective was going, there's a battle over the final 5% of the grid, But in actual fact, the nuclear is not battling against this gas, because nuclear is essentially competing with, as a baseload power, it's essentially competing with renewables in the middle of the day, and that's the problem, I think, with the nuclear as an option, whereas this is essentially gas coming in when there's nothing from renewables. It's the final 5%. It's that, windless, cloudy week or whatever. I'm fascinated by what you guys think is the alternative to this, because I'm also fascinated, to be honest, as to how often we think that 15 gigawatt of flexible gas will actually be operating in a year.
I think, Craig, that we can answer that question, but that it was far too intelligible. You needed to drop a Dunkelflauter into that sentence, and then you're allowed to be on this podcast.
Apologies.
It's an important wedge, and AEMO keep emphasising in their various communications. And, this is important for reliability. In terms of annual energy, through the 2040s, that 15 gigawatts provides about 1.5 to 4.5% of annual electricity. Now, what it would actually do in any given year, I mean, it really does depend on how many Dunkelflauter we get. And in the median year, that would be 0. But every now and then you would have one, and you'd be glad you had an insurance policy. There are a lot of questions that are raised by these 15 gigawatts, and AEMO are trying to emphasise that there's things that need to be solved. They won't just appear. Most of the existing gas peakers, and there's 8 gigawatts or so at the moment, they're going to retire and need to be replaced in that period. What fuel are they going to be burning? Is it going to be natural gas throughout the whole period, or are they going to switch to biogas or hydrogen or a derivative? And what would drive them to do so? There's a bit of a policy gap there. Are these things that barely operate most of the time investable at all under current market design? I suspect maybe no.
Well, they're also, gas peaking is the one thing that gives nuclear a run for its money in terms of its cost.
Well, to run, it's very expensive. To build, you're talking less than $1 a watt of capital cost for the peakers, but then the fuel is super expensive. So I think of it like an insurance policy with a low premium and a high excess. You don't want insurance to be your everyday plan A. You want to have it in the back pocket and rely on it as little as possible.
But what do you guys see if this is required as the kind of Dunkelflaute or whatever insurance policy. What do you think is the most realistic way towards zero emissions from this? Like, are we talking we're going to go back to carbon capture and storage? Is it going to be a biofuel or a hydrogen? I mean, hydrogen unlikely at this point. So what is the option there? Or is it just going to be, no, we burn this gas and that's our kind of little guilty secret each year?
There's a whole question around if you are transitioning to whether it's biomethane or hydrogen, like what is the thing that's going to make that cost competitive with the availability of gas? And at the moment, you don't have the carbon price in the system to allow you to deal with that. I also think there's, like, in terms of the debate around gas, this is almost the least important bit of gas use to argue about. It is in a high penetration renewable energy system providing quite a lot of value. And we are effectively, by relying on gas in, the 2030s and to some degree into the 2040s, buying ourselves some time to allow other, whether it's gas peakers that are drawing on other forms of gas or are just other technologies that come to the party to allow them to mature and get into the system. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge before we get to that last bit of innovation, because I would say that we do want to be aiming for a zero carbon energy system by the time we get to 2050. It should be possible to achieve that, but kind of saying exactly how that's going to be achieved at 25 years hence is a little bit hard. But I think it's also relatively uncontroversial to say that some gas along the way will help us build the bridge to whatever that exact mix of technologies will be down the track.
And the only thing I would add to that is, like, who knows what of the green technologies we talk about frequently might have gone in terms of that further journey on a learning rate curve. So it could well be that batteries are on a learning curve now, but they're in the earlier stages. Like, we're sort of seeing the fruits of many, many decades of investment in solar and wind now. But batteries are a little earlier in that journey. So that last wedge, I feel like that's still up for grabs in 25 to 30 years' time. It could be that batteries have come down a learning curve and there's an application for a type of battery that could fill that gap, or, and there might be a zero carbon alternative for fossil gas to be used. That implies the ability to substitute that fuel with the infrastructure that's been built.
Yeah, it is. I think you're totally right on batteries. We was at Smart Energy Council last week or the week before, were talking about the fact that they'd visited one battery company in China where there were 21,000 people working in R&D. I mean, we're at the very beginning of that technology in a way.
I think that batteries absolutely are going to nibble away at or devour great gobs of the flexible role that gas plays. But I also think that for your Dunkelflaute situation, the problem there is very different to most of the flex problems that we're trying to solve, because it doesn't happen very often. And then when it does happen, it lasts, by definition, it's something that lasts a while. And so the capital costs of batteries scale linearly with the time that they need to run for. If you're keeping a bunch of batteries, even if they're quite cheap, after a lot of deployment and learning and innovation, if you're keeping a bunch of them around sitting there doing nothing for 99.999999% of the time, that's an expensive use of capital. And so something that quacks like a gas peaker, whatever it's burning, that's cheapish to build and eye-wateringly expensive to run, but you're almost never running it, like that's a plausible fit for that kind of problem. And gas, it may be a really poor, as a fuel, may be a really poor fit for this eventually, because we're not going to have a wider, really vibrant gas market for these peakers to dip into. Sorry, future gas strategy. So maybe it's, a lake of biodiesel. Maybe it is salt caverns filled with hydrogen. We're going to have an interesting time finding out, but I think we're going to have a few peakers along the way.
Mate, I object to you apologising to the future gas strategy. The future gas strategy should be apologising to us.
It's just so, I mean, obviously some people will be listening to this and yelling at their podcast saying, well, obviously then we need nuclear because when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow.
I feel like most of those people don't listen to this podcast of grubby centrists, Craig.
The problem with the nuclear model, and the thing that I think is problematic, I haven't heard, I should admit up front, I'm not a Patreon, so I didn't listen to the Patreon nuclear thing.
Patreon.com/let me sum up.
I retroactively withdraw your invitation to appear on this podcast.
As global VP of marketing and extortion, I didn't do a very good job at vetting our guests.
I'm providing my time.
Is this just an elaborate ploy to get us to restate the things we said behind the paywall?
Exactly. This is it. But this is the thing, is that it's weird because the obsession with the whole idea of baseload power, it seems to be an antiquated idea now, because the reason coal is going out of business is that the business model of baseload doesn't work as well because in a renewable system. Isn't that the exact same problem for nuclear?
Yes.
Ha! I got there.
I got the Patreon.
Well, yeah, and I think, and the reason why we're dealing with a renewable system is because it's cheap and available now, and the coal capacity is going off the system in the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years. We just don't have the lead time. This would be a kind of a different debate if we were having it like 15 or 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Because the renewable costs hadn't come down. We would have known quite a lot about like the retirement of coal capacity, and if we were seriously grappling with the need to reduce the emissions intensity of our electricity, the contours of the debate I think would be quite different. But we're not in like 2004, we're in 2024, and we've got that task of replacing all that capacity really, really quickly before us, and so it's almost a moot point. Like, we have to use the technology that is available, and we're incredibly lucky that the technology costs have come down at the rate they have. So it is a super plausible pathway for us to pursue.
So Luke, is what you're really saying, bless John Howard and the Howard government for not only banning nuclear energy in this country, but going through an extended bout of, we don't really need to do anything about this climate stuff. In the early 2000s, when various other people were in France and the United States and the UK and Finland were saying, let's have a nuclear renaissance to help fight climate change. And those projects are coming online about now, 15 to 20 years later, and they're economic stinkeroonies.
Not only that, the Howard government brought in the first solar feed-in tariff as well. So we've pretty much got to thank the Howard government for everything.
What a saint and a savant that man was and is today. So says Luke.
Shall we chat about a report?
Not at all putting words in your mouth there, Luke.
By the way, before we get to the point, Luke, were you excited by how much energy efficiency was counted in Figure 6?
Oh my God! All right,
consumption of the NEM.
Shall we chat about a report?
They're like really? Mate, Craig's worse than we are, Luke.
Yes, yes, he is. Of all the climate impacts predicted by scientists, Earth system tipping points may be some of the scariest. A tipping point is a threshold beyond which a system transitions, often irreversibly, to a dramatically different state. Examples include the collapse of major ice sheets, the release of CO2 and methane as permafrost melts, and the disruption of critical oceanic circulation patterns. And if that isn't enough to keep you up at night, in some cases, crossing one tipping point may contribute to other tipping points being triggered, creating a potentially disastrous domino effect. It is these tipping points that are the subject of a 2023 report titled Global Tipping Points from the University of Exeter's Global Systems Institute. This 452-page monster of a report goes into a lot of detail on the current state of knowledge on Earth system tipping points. However, there is a twist in the tale, as the report's authors also posit that we can pull back from the brink by intentionally triggering so-called positive tipping points in areas such as energy, agriculture, and transport through targeted intentional interventions across behavioural, technological, economic, and political systems. Yes, it is good tipping points versus bad tipping points, according to the University of Exeter. And we had a scan through the summary of this report, but focused on the positive tipping points section, which by itself is 80-odd pages. Frankie, what did you make of it?
Well, it wasn't easygoing in terms of a read, I think it's fair to say, which, is the risk with big synthesis reports like this, where you have a lot of authors bringing to bear a lot of good knowledge. So before we get into positive tipping points, because we did ask our lovely guest Craig on what he might like to focus on this 452-page smorgasbord of delights, there were some, I think, some big things to call out from the summary report that's worth talking about, which we're not going into great detail on. But if I can put it this way, the bad news that this report is really sounding the bell on is that we are in a state at, they're saying today's 1.2 degrees of warming, where it's very likely that at least 5 of our major systems are ready at risk of crossing those tipping points at the present level of global warming. And that includes the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, warm water coral reefs, the North Atlantic subpolar gyre circulation, and permafrost regions as well. And it also says that 2 degrees, more of these systems could tip, and that we can't guarantee with the current level of climate change that's baked in that there won't be more, even at lower levels of global warming that were previously thought. So the sort of headline messages here, it's not a lot of great news, guys, right?
It's interesting, these kind of tipping points. Like one of them was the Atlantic Ocean's great overturning circulation combined with global warming could cause half of the global area for growing wheat and maize to be lost. I mean, that kind of thing is incredibly frightening. I sometimes think that in terms of psychology and, in climate change and action, that these tipping point things can sometimes be the thing that actually leads people to, it's all just too bad, we can't deal with it, that kind of thing. I think that they have a certain role to play, and obviously scientists have to be across them. I find that they're not. I think they can sometimes scare people more than you might need to. I mean, it's a difficult thing. I mean, I have the difficulty that if I'm doing a show on climate for the ABC, I'm broadcasting rather than narrowcasting. So you're broadcasting to a mix of audience, some who are already beyond panic and scared and saying I'm not going to have children, this kind of thing, and some who are kind of going, oh, maybe there's something to this climate change. So it's difficult because you kind of, to one part of that audience, you feel like I do need to show them this kind of extreme tipping points that are, part of the system, but to another part, it just scares the hell out of them. But I do think that the problem with this stuff is when you kind of go, well, it's that final part with Frankie just mentioned, which is the parts that are baked in already might get us to these tipping points. They kind of make people go, well, why are we going to bother making all this change then?
I mean, with all that considered, would you agree with some of the recommendations that are coming, into this summary report? And maybe we can quickly run through those. The first, there's a pretty tight, concise list of recommendations out of this base of a report. Number 1, no surprise, phase out fossil fuels and land use change emissions immediately. Fairly straightforward.
At least to say.
Yeah, at least to say, that's right. Just that easy one over there. There's a call to strengthen adaptation and loss and damage governance. So a lot of what they talk about is existing processes under the UNFCCC, because then it goes into include tipping points in nationally determined contributions. So the commitments that nation states or parties to the Paris Agreement make, tipping points in the global stocktake as well. So I think a lot of this goes to, Craig, giving tipping points much more prominence on the global scale and dialogue around the need for climate action and potentially those risks at crossing those tipping points, keeping that much more present in the minds of policymakers. So what are the other ones that are relevant there as well? Convene a global summit on tipping points and the inevitable more research. So I don't know, considering what you just said about the fact that this could tend to scare people.
But I'm saying that I think that's at a public level. I think that at a policy level and at a government level, then it is useful to have this kind of stuff there, because I think it can be a tendency for people to kind of get used to, the frog in the pot, essentially, get used to going, 2% is going to mean this. Oh, well, there can be a tendency for that. So I think that, I'm not saying there's not a role for it, but I'm just saying I think, it can lead you to the freak out side, which can often lead to people then being like, well, why are we bothering?
Yeah, and the sense of, action can't make a difference is a dangerous sense. In part, dangerous because it's not true. I mean, the tipping points that are noted here, some of them, they mean that individual systems shift to a different state. They're not generally talking about the kind of tipping points some people may have in mind, where Earth as a whole is put on an inevitable course to becoming Venus, with 1,000-degree surface temperatures and clouds of sulfuric acid and what have you. The turning of the Amazon from rainforest to savanna would be a terrible thing in all kinds of ways. It is well worth taking steps to avoid, and being a lot less cavalier and sort of having in mind that there's just a bunch of gradual processes that can be easily arrested. But if it happened, bad as it would not be game over. There would be plenty of bad stuff left to prevent. And ditto for the loss of coral reefs, ditto for changes in ocean circulation patterns. Things could always be worse, is my hopeful declaration.
Yeah, and I do think that, because in the early days of climate, I think we focused a lot on things like rising sea levels, which, I've done a story about that for Foreign Correspondent, where I visited Fijian villages that had had to move and had been flooded and all that kind of stuff. But in Australia, where we've had certain planning laws in place for many years, the reality is that those things feel very far off. So something that's losing half of the kind of wheat and maize belts around the world is something that I think can feel like, everyone can understand immediately the effect of that. People can understand and feel really soon, and, a clear and present danger is important. Yeah, but it is interesting, because it's interesting how, post the Black Summer in Australia, everything felt very real and, generally huge problem, and it felt like this was a big change. That's almost been forgotten as well. So, having a new tipping points to spur action is important.
Well, there is absolutely a correlation in Australia's concern around climate change and whether we're in like the millennium drought or whether we've just had a horrible bushfire season. It is very temporally based and sort of really based around, recent natural disasters. And that is in some ways understandable. People have a lot of stuff going on in their lives, and at the moment it doesn't necessarily feel existential for most people in a really acute way, although they might be very concerned about these issues to different degrees in different parts of the community. And there's just a fundamental challenge in communicating what are actually quite complex concepts when it comes to climate mitigation. And there's just multiple, like tipping points is one, boundaries like 1.5 or 2 degrees, and saying, well, it's still doom and disaster if we don't hit that. When we don't, well, I guess we just give up, do we? But it's not the case that we should just give up. It's the case that 1.6 is the next best target after we breach 1.5 and so on and so forth, because as Tennant said, it can always get worse. There's also just like, slogans like net zero by 2050, like that's lodged in people's brains and everyone's like, oh, fantastic, we've got a bipartisan agreement around that. But a real lack of literacy in the community that actually how you get there is really important.
Not just in the community, that lack of literacy.
we have, well, I have certainly lamented this previously on the pod, but I really feel like now in the 2020s, when we really should be able to be having a much broader ranging conversation about measures needed in every sector of the economy to reduce emissions, that there is really still, I don't think, a broad awareness, out there in the general public on the necessary things that need to happen, not just in the energy system, which is where literally 99.999% of the debate has been focused over the last decade.
Yeah.
But in agriculture, in industry, in the built environment, in transport, I really think the loss of that time over the last 10, 15 years means we're really paying for that now, because we're having to accelerate a lot of conversations now across all of it, which can feel very intense, that we should have been having, in a progressive way over the last little while. And it's feeling like a lot for people.
Yeah. And do you reckon that it's interesting because that kind of leads on to the positive tipping points chapter? Because I think the skeptical take on positive tipping points, and I think they did a reasonable job of maybe arguing against this and showing a bit more complexity to it. But, the skeptical argument could be, unless it's cheaper and better, no one goes for it. And all you talk about, negative tipping points and fires and all this kind of stuff only goes a certain way towards changing people's behaviour. But in the end, if it's not cheaper and better, no one's going to do it.
A big part of tipping points in a lot of these chapters is just learning rates, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Technologies that are, being deployed and costs that are falling. Like you take the learning rates bit out of this and the whole thing collapses. But they are trying to bring in a bunch of different stuff.
Their kind of argument, which is to get a tipping point, you don't just need an economic benefit. You need the idea that was a feedback between technological, behavioural, political and economic processes, and that you needed that feedback between all of them to really get to a tipping point. And I think that was one of the things I took away from it. I don't think it was brilliantly argued, or that I don't think they used nearly enough examples of that. I mean, pretty much their only obsession with German feed-in tariff was about
I think if I was reading this paper, that maybe the unique insight in it for me, because it's trying to introduce a new kind of taxonomy for talking about a lot of the stuff that we're already talking about, on a daily basis in terms of mitigation work that needs to happen, is, I think, trying to put some more considered thinking around the systems-based approach to how all this happens, right? So it's like, it's not just the learning rates, deploy, solar, wind, although it does lean on that example in positive tipping points a lot. I think what it is trying to do is suggest that we can get changes like what we've seen in solar and wind, or the rollout of renewable energy in other parts of, our economies, if we're also seeking to influence the way, change is perceived and desired. So from that behavioural lens, looking at enabling actions that can then be accelerated or leveraged, and also looking at the EU, the US and China could then tip globally, learning rates or cost drops for batteries, which could then have an implication down the track for green ammonia. Like, it was just this whole chain of events. But the point being that I think they're trying to bring to bear a lot of different interventions and try and connect up the ways in which you might roll out various actions, I think, is maybe the unique thing I took away from this document. But it was a really hard slog to read it all.
We're really selling it.
Well, the whole premise of this podcast is that people aren't going to go read this report. We've done that for them.
Yeah, I'm not sure we should be encouraging people to read it. I mean, I love the idea of positive feedback loops and all that kind of stuff and positive tipping points. I wouldn't say I got to the end of that chapter and felt like I'd been convinced they were out there. As a matter of fact, I think it was interesting when it talked about the barriers as well. So if you look at renewables, for instance, which is obviously their example of the positive tipping point, I was just trying to apply that to Australia and where we are, and you kind of go, okay, so there's they talk about social contagion with solar and how that helped and how, it happens in little clusters and groups of people copy each other and, do that kind of stuff, which I think is always a great example of what, changes you make can lead to changes in your neighbours and changes in your neighbourhood and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting if you think about social contagion at the moment, because offshore wind is potentially facing a social contagion the other way, for instance, in Wollongong and the Hunter and that, and pushing back. And so that even though it's cheaper, it may be that the social contagion part of it and the political part makes it really hard to do. Yeah, it's just interesting to show how even in the kind of areas where they show there are tipping points, there are barriers there to the next part of that, I think.
So one of the challenging things with this section is that they do go from some very important and large instances where there really has been a powerful amplifying dynamic and a transformative change that we're living in the middle of. Then what they do, and this is partly on them as authors of this summary who have gone out and chosen a bunch of works from the existing literature to summarise, but they're not themselves writing that literature. They've chosen to look for as many as possible other opportunities to generate tipping points. But the alternative to that, because a lot of their additional options don't seem that prospective to me. They don't involve nearly as strong evidence of learning rates that mean you get this positive cycle of deployment leading to cost reduction, leading to larger markets available, leading to more deployment, more learning, and so on.
Like the one contender, I think, is EVs.
Yeah, but when it comes to all the ideas they have on let's encourage demand reduction for underlying services in energy or transport or food waste reduction, these just seem like things that, I mean, some people are big fans of them, some people get annoyed by them. They seem like things that are just take effort, like all the way along, encouraging rather than getting to some magical tipping point. But the thing I want to say here is just, rather than, let's look for 10 other things that are as amazing and impactful as the changes that are happening in solar costs and battery costs, say, you could say, well, through happenstance and farsightedness and whatever, we've found these incredible technologies that have got a powerful economic and social dynamic around them. How can we leverage those specific ones to make the most change across the economy? And they do talk about super leverage points as well, but which include things like boosting demand for and supply of green ammonia to pull through more hydrogen, to pull through more renewables, transform a bunch of sectors. I think that kind of thing is a lot like having won the lottery on 3 technologies, maybe capitalise on that rather than going down to Tats Lotto for another 10 entries in the lottery.
Well, I actually felt like that was one of the stronger sections where they talked about positive tipping cascades. So as you say, like shifts in particular technologies or sectoral domains kind of feed off each other and catalyse change in adjacent sectors or supply chains. Other examples were electric vehicle demand driving down the cost of batteries, which makes them cheaper for the use for firming renewables, and then the rise in cheap renewable energy and the availability of that tips the balance in terms of affordability away from gas to heat pumps for water and space heating. But the thing about those is that they're plausible and credible because there's a seed crystal, right, of a technology that's already made that leap that is benefiting from those learning rates, and you're able to leverage off it and get into the slipstream. I thought that little section was quite useful and probably deserves more consideration by policymakers. But this was my frustration with the chapter. This 80-odd pages, there would be like half a page of, that's a really interesting idea, and then back to the next 10 pages of slog.
References to other papers that weren't particularly well explained.
Yeah, it made you want to read a lot of other papers because it it just teased you, like, as if this paper said something about it. You're like, what did it say? Oh, you're not going to tell me. I have to go and find that paper. So it felt like reading 100 pages that opened you up to reading 1,000 pages. I thought one of the big takeaways for me was just the importance of good policy as well for all of this stuff. Like, if you look at Norway, I don't know why, in the early parts they mentioned the US as if they'd got to a tipping point with EVs, but that didn't seem to be held up by any of the actual data they had in there, whereas China, Norway, parts of Europe perhaps seem to be, reaching a tipping point there. But again, it talks about the fact that, Norway just had a tax system which ensured that EVs were cheaper, like that kind of thing. Those kind of important policy decisions. The other thing I thought was fascinating was probably one of the only pictures in the whole document too, was the pictures of the bicycle path density in the Netherlands. It was extraordinary. Again, just by actually having good policy and putting in place heaps of bike paths, what a surprise. They've got a way better system there. One of the few examples where active transport works really well. And again, also the example they loved, which was the German feed-in tariff, which then led to, again, there's the flow-on effect. The German feed-in tariff policy, which of course Australia also then copied, so that it's where other countries copy a bit of policy is good, but then also the fact that the German feed-in tariff led to the solar industry growing in China, which obviously is part of it. So policy is just king. I mean, what leads they talk about social movements and they talk about that kind of stuff, but they probably don't draw enough of a link between social movements or what leads to those policies in the first place. I think the only example given was the fact that the Greens, for instance, came to power in Germany, and that's partly what led to that kind of laws being changed that were positive overall. But that actual link to, okay, what leads to good policy in the first place, what role does society play, or campaigning or voting or in that, I didn't think it was particularly well done.
There was a section in this, wasn't there, on political systems and talking about those systems, despite sometimes being resistant to change, can also be tipped.
Also known as politics.
Yeah.
Yes. Are we surprised that a bunch of academics didn't have any wildly insightful things to say about politics? But one of the things that section did talk about, it was big on the idea of climate clubs re-emerged again there as well. So their contagion for good ideas, they thought might be fostered through the building up of international climate clubs to facilitate leadership. And they did talk about that as being focused on particular issues. From memory, they even recalled the example they'd given of a few other places in the document when they talked about, a few big markets, Europe, China, the US really leading the rollout of EVs. And if they were of a mind to accelerate the growth of that and the rollout of batteries, then, all the other potentially cascading effects off of that could be leveraged.
Yeah, so the Climate Club section was another sort of ray of sunshine as I was reading this report. Climate clubs where nation states form coalitions to adopt higher ambition climate policies and along the way promote trade amongst themselves. That seems like a rich vein to mine if you're interested in building political coalitions for positive tipping points that shift in incentive structures in climate politics. But it's just like, it's just like glazed across and then they move on. So it's almost like they're trying to be so comprehensive about anything that could possibly be a tipping point. One thing I'll commend them on is their commitment to their framing device, because almost anything that could possibly be good in any scenario as it relates to climate change, they just work so hard to make it a tipping point.
Yeah, but that's the disappointing thing in a way, because once you get past basically renewable energy, once you get past solar and wind and the beginnings of batteries and EVs, there's not much else there. I mean, the food stuff is really depressing from that perspective.
I was curious in your take on the food stuff. Yeah.
I mean, look, I was fascinated to see, because I do think it's one of the things that's really hard. I think it's one of the hardest things to communicate on, and it seems to be. I know when I was looking at statistics on vegetarianism and the growth in vegetarianism, I'm amazed at how low it is. You know, for all the talk we've had, for all of the debate, not only on climate but also on health we've had, there's so little move away from it. India is the only place that's like potentially around 30%, and that has religious reasons behind it that help in there. It is a really difficult one, and I think that it's one that we don't really make much breakthrough on. You know, Australia sitting at around supposedly 10 to 12%. Not much suggestion of change there. The food chapter was kind of quite depressing. I think the only good stories were the food waste policy stuff from France was interesting, and the fact that other countries had copied that was interesting again. Again, that thing of if one country can break through for whatever reason and have a good policy, the ability for that to then take off in other countries is positive. But yeah, changing people's diet, I did not come out of it feeling particularly positive.
Yeah, I think there's I don't know if this is the right analogy to draw, but it's almost a comparison to the mention of energy sufficiency earlier on. Like, are we going to get to a point where there's a positive tipping point on forcing people to just use a whole lot less energy for no apparent or attractive reason? I guess the thing I took away from that section, focusing also in other endeavours that might win more support, like the alternatives to animal-based products, and it does make that point again that price parity is a really important, perhaps the most important factor in the uptake of meat and dairy alternatives. So, and also
taste.
Well, yeah, that too, but it is important then in the one of the more. It's obvious, but it's worth stating, and it's not stated in quite a lot of policy documents. Other grains or agricultural products receive substantially more subsidies from government still than these type of products. So, like, government, if it's minded to, could direct its effort elsewhere to subsidise and to help get alternatives to animal products further down that cost curve.
But again, that's that point that it's kind of like there's no policy there. But is there no policy there because there's also very little push from the community? There's very little support for that. It's kind of seen as controversial.
Yeah. There's a lot of nervousness. And in the United States this year, there's been a mini wave of efforts at the state level, successful efforts in some states to ban meat substitutes, to ban cell-based or plant-based meats.
Yeah. I did a story for Foreign Correspondent where we went to a particular state legislature that had legislation there that had been put together by the cattle lobby to make it so the word meat couldn't be used for alternative meats at the time. So
yeah, and there's a long history of this kind of thing with butter and margarine. And there's long-standing legislation in Quebec, for example, that you can't colour the margarine yellow. It's got to have its unprocessed, somewhat unattractive natural colour, that kind of thing. But preemptively actually banning a technology is a step beyond that. And one of the things that's going on there is the fear that if the technology is allowed to, of meat substitutes is allowed to be deployed and it gets good, policy interventions will follow that restrict the eating of meat. And in effect, they are anticipating the opponents exactly the kind of concerted sort of policy and innovation nexus that this report is sort of trying to encourage. So I don't think that I don't think Ron DeSantis has read this report. If he has, good luck to him. But it's generating its own backlash in a way.
Yeah. What did you think of the key recs in that section that talked about, and perhaps one of the ways of building social license for governments to do stuff, were this idea of policy councils or citizens' assemblies where you'd get, collections of hundreds of people to, come together, talk about the issue, validate potential solutions. I feel like you're then sort of starting to go, well, isn't that the purpose of a representative parliament to start with? It seemed like there was some admission that the polity is not in touch.
There is no problem so complex, Frankie, that a climate academic doesn't think the deliberative democracy will solve it.
Or expert elicitation.
Indeed.
I think the theory is, and I think because they do generally you point to the kind of French example of the French Citizens' Assembly on Climate, which, was a lot more kind of progressive than the Parliament might have been. And in a place like Australia where your Parliament is largely sewn up by fossil fuel interests, it could be that you need to look outside that particular venue to come up with the best solutions. But look, I think doing it well is the hard part.
I don't know. I think even in France, they have had waves of backlash from other bits of the community to some policies identified as green, even if they weren't always particularly motivated by that. Yeah, I'm just a bit dubious about the over-application of tipping because the nature of a tipping point is that the new system is as resistant to change and flipping back as the old system was to being flipped. And that is, I think, clearly true of the changes that are happening to energy systems as a result of the learning dynamic with some technologies. Even if policy tries to move around, these just very, very hard to go back. Even with positive social changes and positive political changes, I don't know that they all do have this quality of sticking. I think you can history is not an inevitable march of progress.
Yeah, totally. I was looking at the Lowy Institute's kind of figures on attitudes to climate over the years since about 2006, and we haven't even got back. There's a huge change over time. It's at its worst when we're having the Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard debate about climate tax and that kind of stuff. But we haven't even got back to the kind of rates of 2006 in terms of support for doing something about climate. So I agree that when it comes to actual debate and the politics, I don't think there is a tipping point. I think it can go back, be pushed back against. I mean, for instance, I think it'd be fascinating if they would look at the community independent movement that came in the last election as to whether or not, was that a tipping point, or is that something that was very specific to the circumstances at the time, the Black Summer, the fact that Scott Morrison was one of the least popular prime ministers going into election. There's all these factors there that probably won't repeat in the next election. Will there be something totally different happen?
The other thing that gets me about this tipping points framing is...
We're a bit down on the tipping points framing of late.
I was pro tipping points until I read 80 pages of the word tipping point. I have tipped into anti-tipping point. I have reached the tipping point of the word tipping point and became anti-tipping point.
But you could flip back at any moment, Craig. So Look, if we were to accept the kind of the framing device and the premise that there's all these tipping points around the place, and they are our last great hope to deal with all the negative tipping points that most of the rest of the report is all about, the level of kind of omnipresence and agency and surgical interventions that one would need to execute to kind of catalyze all these tipping points that they're describing. Like we talked in our 50th episode about us going back in time and murdering one person to solve climate change. You would need like an army of SWAT teams bouncing around time all over the place and making all of these interventions to actually pull this whole thing off. It's just totally implausible that, anyone is going to have the presence of mind and the foresight to actually, influence all of these different systems in the ways that they're describing.
We just need Ozymandias from Watchmen.
There you go.
You just need a reclusive billionaire who's trained his mind on ancient Greek philosophy for decades, plotting some kind of horrendous crime to tip the world into a different state. I think what Dr. Manhattan, this is a really intellectual podcast now, what Dr. Manhattan says to Ozymandias is nothing ever ends. There is no final definitive victory after which everything is fine. We are haunted by the consequences of our actions forever.
I reckon what we need is not a comic book hero. What we need is an army of charismatic broadcasters and comedians to create war-themed shows about every single one of these sectors.
Yes, some of these sectors would be hard to do that for.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
So I would like to give a shout out to the very recent, as we record, the Safeguard Symposium that the Carbon Market Institute held at Parliament House, which was a conclave of plenty of excellent people. I bumped into a lot of summer-uppers, including Dr. Tessa Leach of Climate Works, who revealed herself to be a long-time listener. And there was terrific discussion at the symposium of a lot of things around how the carbon market is going within Australia and how the safeguard could be evolved to be relevant to a lot more sectors and potentially incorporate a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which was much discussed. The only other thing I'll say about the symposium is that the Minister for Climate Change and Energy was in attendance. He made some remarks. I took the opportunity to ask Chris Bowen a question about a curly possibility for Article 6.2 deals between Australia and countries we export stuff to that lower their emissions and increase our emissions. And could we do some nifty accounting? And he said that was not an issue that he was thinking about at the moment, but it could be a subject for a very erudite podcast.
And then he said, please remove this man from the room.
Minister Bowen doing our forward programming for us now.
Yes.
Thanks for signing us up to something else.
Yeah, Tennant just asked a question to try and get the minister to make you cover this in your podcast. I want to see the transcript of his answer. I'm not entirely sure the end of his answer was that would be a good thing to be covered in a podcast. And
the whole room laughed and I snorted loudly.
Okay.
We will get right on that.
Oh, God.
Frankie, what have you got?
I am going to do a plug for another summer-upper of this pod, Tim Forsey, who, amongst many things he's done, he is one of the founders of the very prominent Facebook group My Efficient Electric Home, which is like very well patronised these days. I think I joined onto it when there were like maybe 20,000 odd people on there. Don't know what the numbers are these days, but a lot more than that. Tim has written a book by the same title, My Efficient Electric Home Handbook, How to Slash Your Energy Bills, Protect Your Health and Save the Planet, based on a lot of good advice. Tim is an advisor to people who are wanting to do energy efficiency and electrification projects on your home. It's going to be full of useful, sensible advice. That'll be, a great bit of guidance for anyone out there looking to make their homes efficient and electric. So that's very exciting. And just a big congrats to Tim. I think he's on the tour at the moment. Kind of seen him popping up at a few events. I think he was at something last week with Lily D'Ambrosio down in Victoria. So anyway, it's great to see a champion for household efficiency and electrification getting the attention he deserves. So bravo, Tim.
He was indeed. I was at that very launch event.
You went. So
I went.
Good.
I endorse Frankie's endorsement. It's a cracking read. And available in all good bookshops. Craig, what have you got?
I'm not sure if this counts as a one more thing, but for those of us who, I'm sure like yourself, spent about a week after the nuclear announcement dealing with people saying, oh, the thing is that solar and wind are cheaper, but you've got to consider the battery costs and the transmission costs. And then explain to them that GenCost did actually consider those. That was actually factored in. My current obsession is when we do get the costings of nuclear, we really need to have the costings for the continuation of coal and whatever else is going to be there. I mean, basically in New South Wales, the government's just made a deal with Eraring to keep it going for 2 years longer. And that runs up to $450 million. It's not guaranteed it will be that, but it's $450 million for 2 years. An enormous part of the expense of this nuclear policy is just how the hell do we keep going new gas or old coal to keep the slot there for nuclear at the end. And I think that making sure, that I'm just obsessed by that being part of the costings because it fascinates me.
Do you want those costings just out to 2035 to 2037 when the two nuclear plants will come online?
Yes, I'm a little sceptical that we will get it there that early.
I agree with that. I think that's a good focus. And Frankie, to your point about the duration, I have heard lately that people are suddenly very keen on costing things for 80 to 100 years.
Yes, I've noticed that too.
And if we're interested in assets out that long, maybe we would be interested in the impacts of over that time period of the higher emissions we will produce for the next 15 to 20 years if we don't get our act into gear. We will be paying higher costs for a long time to come, just from what we do in the meantime.
I hope that wasn't covered in your special nuclear donors only podcast.
Tearing down the paywall.
You're just like the rest of the Australian political system. You just give preference to donors.
My one more thing is that I wanted to give a shout out to a significant milestone that we've just crossed in Victoria because the Victorian government has released a consultation paper on minimum rental standards for insulation, draft proofing, hot water and air conditioning, which is a big step forward, taking care of some of the most vulnerable in our community and building on the momentum created by the recent reforms in ACT. They brought in minimum rental standards for ceiling insulation last year. Details are important. If you're interested in all of that, on my other podcast, First Fuel, there's an episode in which I have a chat with the Victorian Minister, Lily D'Ambrosio, about many things, but we spend a bit of time on the rental standards. And having told you all you can't have one more things. I'm going to have another one more thing. But
oh, what?
I'm sure
Corruption.
that you will endorse this because my last one more thing is that Tennant's recent speech entitled "The Sun is a Harsh Mistress" and available on LinkedIn is a bloody good read and reminds us that a global competitive advantage on zero carbon energy isn't just going to fall in our lap. We're going to have to work for it. And I strongly recommend it, even if, as one commenter pointed out, Tennant, it is shockingly bereft of memes and charts.
Well, I withdraw my accusation of corruption, and I've been turned around on this whole one more, two more things issue.
Link in the show notes. And that is our show for today. Craig, before we roll into our shameless self-promotion and spruiking for donors, is there anything that you would like to promote?
Not really. If you're in the New South Wales or Sydney area, I now do breakfast radio on ABC 702 from 5:30 to 8 a.m. pretty much every day, Monday to Friday. So come and listen.
There you go. Do you do ISP content most mornings, or?
Look,
That's the core of breakfast radio, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of ISP coverage. It's interesting. I mean, the nuclear policy has meant that some of what I would thought my more obscure knowledge has come to the fore a little bit. It's become a bit more front of mind recently.
It's God's work, Craig. Good on you. So if you have comments, questions, if you are not Australia's Energy and Climate Minister and actually have to email us to put things on our agenda, you can send them to mailbag@letmesumup.net. And we also have a back catalogue of episodes, Frankie. Where would our listeners find those?
You can find every single episode that we've recorded, except for the exclusive BOCO that Craig was so keen to get at today, on letmesumup.net.
Curse you all.
And Tennant, if our listeners like what we're doing, how can they support us and access some of that sweet BOCO?
They should go to patreon.com/letmesumup. And you would not believe the plenitude of extraordinary bonus content that you will find there. Most obviously, yes, the nuclear episode, full of more gems of wisdom than Craig could possibly have hinted at in this episode, and so much more.
Is it true that if you are a special guest on Let Me Sum Up in an episode that goes over 1.5 hours in the record, that you get free access to the Patreon? I thought I read that in this fine print.
I knew this was coming.
It depends how many of the rabbit holes over 1.5 hours you personally were responsible for, Craig.
Yeah, that's true. I contend this podcast would have been a tight 45 minutes without you.
Just like all the other ones.
I think I may have listened to too many for you to be able to get away with that argument.
For Frankie Muscovich, Tennant Reed and Craig Rucastle, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.